Hi there, this is Melissa Haley, and I am going to talk to you today about explaining the information about brokerage services form. This is a form that I think can be transformational in your business. If you will learn to explain it, learn to really uh, digest it and internalize it and be able to provide that information back to a consumer, specifically a buyer, I do believe that this will help you obtain buyer representation agreements on a more consistent basis. So let's begin. So of course, you know that as a Texas Realtor, you are required to give this information to your consumer at that first substantive dialogue, right? So we're talking to this consumer about potentially buying a property, talking to them maybe about a home that they're interested in, and we provide them with this information. And when I begin speaking to this consumer and I hand them this form, or I have it pulled up on my screen if I'm on a Zoom call and I'm screen sharing, and I let them know this form is required that I give you this information by Texas real estate law. And it's really just information for you, home buyer, to let you understand you have some options with regarding your purchase of this property. So the first thing I let them know is there are different types of license holders. There are brokers and there are sales agents. And the broker is responsible for all of the brokerage activities, including what the sales agents do. So that lets the buyer know that there is a chain of command, right? And then I let them know the broker does have some minimum duties that are required by law. For example, we must put the interest of our client above the interest of everyone else, including ourselves. We must inform the client of any material information that we receive about the property. We must answer the client's questions and, as a matter of fact, present any offers and counter offers to the client. And we must treat all parties to a real estate transaction honestly and fairly. And generally speaking, you do all of those things and probably many more things for your buyer. Then I come to this next section and I explain to them that real estate professionals have different jobs depending on who we represent. When we represent an owner, a seller, or a landlord, now our job is to help that seller or that landlord get that property under contract, get it sold or rented out, and looking out for that seller's best interest, which generally speaking is to get them the most money for that property, right? To get them the best return on their investment. However, the shoe is on the other foot when we represent a buyer or a tenant. Now, when we represent a buyer or a tenant, this means that we are going to look out for their best interest, which generally speaking is not paying the most money for the house. And so, of course, anytime we are an agent for both, we are an intermediary, which means we represent the buyer and the seller. And if that ever happens, we do have additional rules that we must follow because it wouldn't necessarily be fair if we told the buyer that the seller could afford to sell for less, or if we told the seller that the buyer could afford to pay more, right? So we must be careful when we become an intermediary. And then I let them know as a potential buyer that we could also be a sub-agent. And a sub-agent, and it clearly says it right here, is a license holder who is aiding a buyer in a transaction without an agreement to represent the buyer. And it says right here that the sub-agent can assist the buyer, but does not represent the buyer and must place the interests of the owner or the seller first. And of course, as I get to this section, generally speaking, what happens is that a home buyer starts to say, or a potential home buyer starts to say, wow, how can I hire you? Because I don't want you to help me by just opening a door and then not help me by looking out for my best interest. Then, of course, I let them know that in order to avoid disputes, everything will be in writing. So we will have a written agreement to represent them as a buyer. And then I give them the chain of command down here at the bottom. I make sure that they know that I am the sales agent and this is all of my contact information. And while I know I'm going to do a great job for them and hopefully they're not going to have any issues, but if they did have any issues, this is how they could talk to a supervisor or to the broker, and certainly have the brokerage information here at the bottom of this page. Of course, immediately after going into this information, I also provide them with the consumer protection notice as well as the buyer representation agreement. But generally speaking, after I have gone over all of this information, my potential clients, my customers, generally at that point decide they would love to be a client because they really want you to represent them and their best interest in the transaction. I hope this was helpful. I hope you're able to get more clients under a buyer representation agreement by using this tactic and this information. And I hope that you get out there and do some great business.